While connected technology is essential for unlocking new efficiencies on the production floor, it's also presented hackers with new opportunities to steal valuable IP and data. To support OT professionals in their battle with cyber criminals, we launched the Security Breach podcast. In each of our over 100 episodes, we've brought in cybersecurity specialists to provide valuable insights and break down critical topics. As a go-to podcast for our listeners, we want to help you align your brand with our expertise. By sponsoring our podcast, your brand will build trust, and your message will stand out to an audience searching for tools to assist their cybersecurity efforts. Secure your share in this rapidly growing segment by sponsoring Security Breach. Contact us today to learn more. Hi, I'm Jeff Franke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. We're going to switch things up a little bit for this episode. Instead of tapping into one source for feedback and updates on industrial cybersecurity, we're going to look at some of the key insights previous guests have offered on the evolving threat landscape. From increased risks emanating from technological integrations and an uptick in automation to the more traditional adversaries responsible for next-generation malware, ransomware, and phishing schemes. To kick things off, let's hear from Tom Marsland, VP of Technology for Cloud Range, as he discusses threats to our infrastructure and state-sponsored groups from China. He'll be followed by Cyberhoot's Craig Taylor as he updates us on phishing schemes, and then we'll hear from Jon Taylor at Versa Networks as he talks about strategies bad actors are taking in targeting legacy industrial control systems. In going back and forth with your PR team, they described you as the attack master. So it would lead to believe that you've got some background into, well, a great awareness of all the vulnerabilities and things that are going on that are, well, the darker side of cybersecurity, if you will. What are you seeing right now on the industrial front? Are there certain trends that you're seeing, whether it's the types of attacks, vulnerabilities that are being exposed, or maybe some groups that are kind of lighting up your radar right now?
A lot of the groups we're focusing on right now are frankly coming straight out of China. If you look at any of the typhoon groups that you're seeing in the news today, Volt Typhoon was a major focus of our organization for the last 6 months. There were specific threat advisories that came out from CISA, the FBI, the NSA, and Microsoft around that threat organization. And they strike a chord specifically with me because I spent 22 years in the military myself, and they're targeting critical infrastructure around our military bases. There's some spin-offs of those threat groups that we don't know how close they're tied. We all know they're China, but Salt Typhoon and Flax Typhoon are the others out there that are, again, specifically targeting critical infrastructure and industrial cybersecurity. I hate to say it, Jeff, but the thing that we're seeing the most is the basics. If you look at the CISA advisories, they just put out a great one around election infrastructure just about a month ago now. And again, it was things like multi-factor authentication, patch tracking and remediation, asset identification, and the same things are true in the industrial sector.
No, I think we still have a lot of those mindsets that we're looking to change. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about before about culture and understanding size doesn't matter. Sector doesn't matter. If you've got, as one previous guest put it, if you've got money and resources and a network, they're going to find you and you're going to be vulnerable to an attack at some point. So
absolutely. We're only human, and we can only do so much, but it really starts with strong foundations. You can map a program to multiple different frameworks, whether it's the NIST 800 series of frameworks, or even for, my recommendation for small and medium businesses, the people that don't have a dedicated information security team, is just look at the Center for Internet Security and the basic controls they have there. If you can get 10 out of those 20, you're probably better than 75% of the organizations that we're working with out there today.
So, in the intro, I went through a bunch of stats talking about how phishing is still this huge concern. We've known about it for a long time, but people are just not taking the right actions. Maybe you could give us a little bit of sort of an overview of the landscape a little bit in terms of maybe what are some of the new tactics the hackers are using, and why are we just not responding or getting ready to or preparing ourselves to handle these types of attacks?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's one that I think a lot about, Jeff, because it's not rocket science. Phishing attack is a flavor of social engineering. Hackers know that they can get people to click. If they can get people to click, they can do things like install malware, steal credentials, or even session tokens. You asked about what's changing and new in phishing attacks, and it's this post-authentication theft of your session token. So when you log into a bank or your email system, you get delivered a token. Usually it's encrypted between you and them, but it lives in your computer. And sometimes when you click on a malicious link, it can reach in and steal that session token. So the reality is phishing is today and has been for the last 20 plus years the number one way hackers breach companies and individuals. It hasn't changed. What has happened, what has changed is the frequency, the impact, and the damage that's done when you fall victim to a phishing attack. As I started to say, it's not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward stuff. But I'll tell you this, you can graduate from MIT or any Ivy League school or high school or any school educational institution in the country with zero cyber literacy training today. You can have computer literacy, that's completely different. But cyber literacy, how to operate an email account, a calendar, a computer safely and securely, it's lost on our educational system. And so, companies and individuals need to step up and learn these skills, because it's the cost of doing business today is so enormous when you make a mistake in this space.
I see a lot of hacktivists or state-sponsored hackers looking at infrastructure, whether it's water treatment, energy facilities, whatever, and attacking these outdated ICSs. And they're sort of putting out a blueprint, if you will, for other hackers then to hit the industrial control system. Obviously, that's a concern. That's a huge threat. But are they also sort of tipping their hand a little bit? Is this helping the industrial sector to also understand a lot of these other vulnerabilities within the ICS that maybe they wouldn't have looked at before? Which way do you see that going?
I think it's both, right? I think it's number one, it's incredibly dangerous. If I had to sit there and say what's my boogeyman that keeps me up at night is things like that. Yeah. So I will absolutely say that this is, attacking things like the energy sector, right, and so forth is probably one of the most dangerous things that we can possibly have. The other side of that is that from an OT perspective, we've never went through and done things like pen testing. We've never went through and tried to find the vulnerability, like you just said. So it is tipping the hand. It is helping us, right? The question is going to end up being is this going to be something that really is it something that the word I'm looking for is it more dangerous for us to allow them to continue to do what they're doing, right? As we're so reactive for it, or is this the turning point, right? And I can't answer this, right? I think the industry itself has to answer this. But is this the turning point where where the industry is going to start looking at itself, looking at how it's architected, right, for its ICS systems? And then is it going to start bringing in more of those IT controls, right, toward the end of the day? And then start also bringing in other grooming aspects like, are we going to start doing pen testing? Are we going to start, having cybersecurity, become the staple, right, within that solution, right, within that OT architecture, moving forward? So therefore we can rapidly speed up, right, and catch these threats before they're happening. And I think this is a great turning point to be able to make that happen, because we're seeing more and more come out. Right now we can actually go and we can architect to that, and then we can architect beyond that, because if we're going to take solutions down and systems down to put the architecture in, now's the time to make it a robust architecture to where we can prevent future threats from coming in and be able to be proactive against that.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's an interesting sort of double-edged sword, because I've always been such a huge advocate of more transparency about these attacks and sharing more best practices. I think the advancements that the industrial sector in particular has made since Colonial Pipeline is enormous in terms of what's being shared. But like you said, there's still a lot to keep us up at night. While many of these topics are already at the top of our list of concerns, there are also a number of evolving threats that warrant an uptick in resources from both a financial and skill set development perspective. Let's dive into comments from Corsha's Anusha Iyer as she discusses supply chain and dwelling attacks, Venafi's Kevin Bocek and his take on embedded software vulnerabilities and how hackers are taking advantage of them, Baker Tilly's Jeff Krull offers an update on the evolving complexity of ransomware groups and how they're targeting the industrial sector. And finally, let's wrap up with one of my favorite guests we've ever had on Security Breach, researcher Jeremiah Fowler. He'll offer some insight on a number of unique, embedded threats and some of the lessons he's learned in tangling with state-sponsored Russian hackers.
Threat landscape for industrial control systems has just exploded, and maybe there's an element of having an improved posture by doing it as a community, right? I think that's been a lot of the benefits of like cyber on the IT side. It has become much more of like community driven, like threat intel and so forth. So it's great to see that when we're talking about kind of new strains and advanced attacks targeting like critical infrastructure and energy, manufacturing, transportation, water treatment. So I think also we're seeing like evolving malware families of just like even previous strains of maybe, 5 years ago, you take like a Stuxnet, and now you're seeing new strains of it again that's targeting newer protocols, newer PLCs. And certainly, I think the whole AI age, industrial networks are not immune to it. And we're seeing a lot of like AI powered, like ICS based malware. So some of it is regulatory driven. Some of it is like, kind of dealing with the reality of the day. So, when you talk about like autonomous malware, for example, like the rise of AI powered ICS malware can have a pretty substantial impact. And so you kind of have to have trust in the connections in your network and, have a strong identity story there.
Absolutely. No, it's interesting when you bring up that malware. I think since they busted Lockbit, it's reappeared in like 3 or 4 different names or something like that. So it is kind of crazy. So one of the areas, we talked about all these connections and all the different vulnerabilities and all the weak spots that can sort of turn up. It sort of leads into one of the biggest areas that is we've seen sort of an uptick in even more malicious activity, and that's for manufacturing supply chains. A lot more going on there. I have a feeling there are so many more we don't know about and don't hear about. We hear about the big ones, like Clorox, Dole Foods, where they got in through a software opening and it really it not only messed up production at those facilities, but then it led into the distribution, the retailers, the logistics providers, and impacts so many more companies, puts additional pressure to pay the ransom, all that kind of stuff. I'd really like to get your take in terms of what you're seeing on the supply chain level, in terms of what are some of the trends the hackers are using to get in, some of the longer term effects, and maybe some of the best practices that you've seen to help ward off some of those attacks.
Yeah. I mean, I think the cost itself has been ever increasing of a breach, right? So I think today the average total cost of a breach has reached an all-time high, with being an average of like 4.5 million in US dollars, like over a 2% increase from the year before. And so particularly when we're talking about supply chain attacks and connecting more infrastructure, you sort of have to shore up the security of those connections and the data movement. I think it is twofold. There's certainly an increase in malware that's targeting the industrial control system itself, right? And I think leveraging existing vulnerabilities of equipment that we're seeing across manufacturing shop floors from some pretty household names in terms of vendors. But then also, you alluded to like the supply chain attacks, where what's really alarming about those is how they can be dormant and just kind of reconnaissance focused for a while. And so really looking at more of that shift left into what's the code that's going into controllers, like what's the asset that's being dropped into the industrial network, and who's put eyes on it, like who's looked at the bill of materials, not just from a hardware perspective, but also from a software perspective. And then in terms of best practices, I think the biggest thing is to kind of know and pin your network, right? Know and pin the connections, like up and down, whether it is, the OT network or whether it is connections out, like basically maintain that observability and control in a very dynamic way and have a good way to really define what identity means, right? I think increasingly what we're seeing is the original definitions of machine identity, especially in industrial networks, like as an IP address, as a cryptographic key, like all of these hard-coded sort of simple definitions of identity don't hold up anymore, right? Yeah. And that's where we're seeing the defense in depth, the zero trust principles really making an impact. Like these, whether they are introduced vulnerabilities or accidental ones, we have to assume they're going to keep happening.
Yeah, they're not slowing down for sure. Like you said, I mean, the ransomware numbers are going up. Even though they talk about some of these attacks in different areas going down, I would argue I think they're still very high. A lot of them still just don't get reported because they're happening to a lot of smaller organizations that didn't think they were a target. And then also that feeds off of what you were talking about, those live off the land or dwelling attacks. I think that is the biggest plague for a lot of these industrial control systems. People are just not understanding how to kick them out. And they continue to get hit over and over again. It's very interesting and also kind of frightening. Yeah. But when we talk about risk, it's sort of just this looming element there that we just don't want to talk about. And we're balancing risk between we don't want to get shut down, we don't want to get ransomed, but we also don't want to get left behind. Could you talk a little bit about this convergence of risk? And it means different things at different levels. But again, how can we get folks to really appreciate what it means and what they do every day?
Well, I wanted to say, I think there's one good thing that's, although certainly I know many teams were challenged, that's occurred recently. Many of the audience would have been impacted from the CrowdStrike outage. It's a perfect example, I think, to demonstrate cyber risk to executives, to the board, and drive funding, drive the understanding of what can happen. Because there you had, that was thankfully just a software update that went awry, but it could have been, though, of course, much worse. It could have been a malicious software update. We've seen that. Of course, I think Stuxnet is the prototype of that. So what I would say is that's a perfect opportunity now to take that as a demonstration. Aha, this is what can happen. We've seen it happen. And thankfully, it wasn't a cyber attack. And I think then when it comes to risk, well, I think the audience has probably done a pretty good job. There's over the years, and I think now we just have to take that now and bring it to cyber, because there's an operational risk to availability. There's an operational risk. There's the risk to integrity of our systems. And then, of course, the protection of the proprietary data that's being generated on the floor and then being sent back up for analytics and planning and supply chain. So, of course, many of the audience will know that's that CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I think that really well describes, and again, I think you can describe that to an executive about what then risk means down at the manufacturing floor, the plant floor, in ways then that they can get. Because, the confidentiality of all of that data that's being generated now and being sent, it's being trained for supply chain, machine learning for supply chain analysis, that is highly sensitive. That is something that, in many ways, from the product itself that's being manufactured, may have, in many ways, the same value. And of course, to availability, well, perfect. We saw the example of what can happen. And then, of course, integrity can have an impact on either one of them. Any of our systems then that are manipulated then has the opportunity for, to bring systems down or to breach that confidentiality.
No, it's a great parallel between CrowdStrike and Stuxnet. We've got plenty of folks out there in the critical infrastructure side of things that Stuxnet still creates shivers up and down everybody's spine a little bit in terms of what that spawned.
Well, we see that happening. Of course, we see it often times with software updates that have been maliciously created, or software update systems that are taken over, endpoint systems, laptop systems, and yes. So I think that's the thing too. We talked about more and more connections. That's certain. That's a certainty. So I think, yeah, that's a great way to demonstrate. And of course, too, very timely now for the audience, although I imagine this is going to be replayed a few weeks later. We've seen recently what appears to be supply chain attacks, certainly in the Middle East, that may have been combined with cyber attacks. So, yeah, I think Stuxnet is the prototype. We've seen what can happen with CrowdStrike. And I think that CIA triad gives us a really great way just to communicate that to executives and then executives on up to the board.
Absolutely. Well, you talked about stuff going on in the Middle East. That's when we get into state actor sort of things and those hackers that are going on out there. What type of activities are you seeing right now? Has there been a spike? Are we seeing more state-sponsored type stuff? Is it supply chain focused? What types of trends are you seeing in terms of either attacks or vulnerabilities or groups that are kind of raising havoc right now?
Yeah, definitely what we see as a trend over, I would say, especially since COVID times, is that the adversaries, and of all types, nation state, through to, those are motivated either by profit or by intent, definitely attacking more and more the software development lifecycle, the software supply chain, which then can have a very much a kinetic effect, again, as we saw with CrowdStrike, because I'm sure many then physical systems then were offline. So we have been seeing that. We're seeing adversaries look to try and tamper with software. For example, insert vulnerabilities in open source software that you might think has no impact on a plant floor, but absolutely does, because either it gets built into software you use or you're using it directly. We've seen the adversary again try and steal, for example, the way that you authenticate code that then gets installed, because again, all of these systems are machines and they know no difference between a good software update and a bad software update, a malicious one. So we see the adversary trying to steal the code signing certificates that are used to authenticate software that's updated on systems. So and it's at all levels. It's at the nation state level, and it's also those motivated by ransom, by profit.
Yeah, the software stuff is really scary, and it's kind of a combination between very complex tactics, but also very basic types of things that the hackers are still doing because it works. So why would they stop? Baker Tilly put out their Guide to Ransomware Prevention. So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the things, how you're seeing industrial ransomware and all the challenges associated with it from your perspective.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? Ransomware is everywhere. So every industry is getting hit with ransomware.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different attack vectors, right? So in some industries, people are going almost all the time, they're looking for a ransom to be paid, right? So they're looking to get in, lock things up, cause disruption, and cause disruption on a scale that people are sort of forced into paying the ransom, right? In a lot of industries, actually, they're also going after, personally identifiable information, things like that has some value out in the dark web, or some ability to hold it over somebody's head if they don't pay the ransom. So they get kind of that double whammy. You also get that even in the industrial sector, right, where maybe they steal some IP that they don't want getting out there. Somebody doesn't want their customer upstream, downstream to know that IP's been taken hostage. So we're really seeing that across the spectrum, right? That it's not just the initial let's lock things up, but then it's like, what other value can we extract from the attack? Specific in really the manufacturing and industrial sector, you really get into a lot of ransomware where if they can lock up things that are mission critical to running the operations, they can force somebody to pay, right? So if it's, hey, I have 300 people out on the floor who showed up for work today and nothing's working, so we can't make anything today, that's a big problem, right? So there's a real immediate P&L hit that organizations feel. Sadly, what we're finding is because these criminal organizations are so well funded now, right? They found ways to make money. They found ways to get the Bitcoin, whatever it is they're extracting out. They're also reinvesting, right? So they're getting more sophisticated. They're saying, they're almost like a normal business enterprise at this point. Hey, we made $500,000 locking up this kind of manufacturing facility. Who else is out there? Let's research it. Let's see who else uses that software stack we just saw. Let's find ways we can, do the intelligence to get out there and find that stuff. And the real scary thing is, in a lot of cases, everybody thinks ransomware happens, and it's like, oh, well, they broke in yesterday and they launched their ransomware today. Usually that's not the case. They're in there for a while. They're searching, they're snooping. So maybe they already know who the other 10 top competitors are to a given organization. And so now they have 10 other organizations to go target. So it's really becoming difficult to protect against ransomware effectively, right? It's getting harder and harder, I should say. A lot of the normal things you do to protect are still the same, but it's just getting harder because they're getting smarter and smarter at how they're trying to extract that value for themselves.
Well, I think, connecting the dots here with the OT security space that we really target our audience with, there's always that place where you have to start. And we've seen this in a lot of big industrial organizations. They start on the IT side with a lot of these software platforms, ERP being a huge part of the manufacturing enterprise or the industrial enterprise. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is you came across a really interesting breach that centered around an ERP company, ClickBalance, based out of Mexico. And I'll kind of let you take it from there, Jeremiah. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how you discovered this situation and what it all turned into.
Yeah, so, and that's the thing. There are many smart people all around the world. I've worked actually I live in Europe now, but I lived in Ukraine. And, we're just talking about Mexico is becoming an outsourcing hub, the same way that Ukraine was an outsourcing hub, because young, smart people realize that you can control your destiny, work how you want, and you don't have to go through this traditional bureaucratic layers of a real world business. And so IT is really something that you can do from anywhere in the world. When I'm looking for data, the first thing I do is I see what it is, and then I try to validate the finding. And I'm always looking for data. So when I found this, I saw that there was just under like 1 billion records. I think it was 769 million. And inside of that, there were like 380 something thousand email addresses. And that opens an entire can of worms, because one of the biggest risks right now to security, yes, of course, ransomware, of course, malware, but social engineering is a huge issue. And especially when you're talking at a corporate level, if you're going through and you're looking and researching who are the key players, who are the top people, who has access to what, and if you target them, you already have their email address, you already have internal data, you already have many of the tools you need for a successful social engineering campaign. And so when I find it, I try not to leave a database open for long. I really try to, I never download the data I find. I try to do like a limited sample of everything, get a real understanding of what's there, and then I send a responsible disclosure notice. So in this case, I sent the responsible disclosure notice. They closed it down immediately. It's not uncommon, but I didn't hear anything back. And there's many reasons for that. Some companies just want to put their head in the sand. Some companies just don't trust. They're like, oh no, I'm not falling for this scam. They hacked us. Yeah. And I've heard this before, and that's unfortunate that we live in that world where fear dominates response, but it doesn't help your customers and it doesn't help your data. Having a good response plan, because I'm here to tell you, doing this for 10 years, it's not if you had a data incident, it's when. And being proactively prepared is just as important as having a response plan, because then you're not running around blind. You know who's responsible for what's your messaging going to be, your key stakeholders you have to reach out to. And so I don't really know the fallout of that. And they've been in business for 25 years. I saw a lot of IP addresses from the United States, Canada, and with free trade and the networking between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and probably around the world. Who knows what, how big they were or the outreach that they had to their customers.
Well, 769 million records tells you they have quite an extensive reach and into a lot of different industrial sectors, or different sectors, I should say, business areas. Do you know what vulnerabilities were exploited, how the hacker was able to get in and steal this much data?
Well, this was a misconfigured database. So, as you know, to the best of my knowledge, no hackers were in there yet. But in the limited sampling of documents that I saw, I did see access keys. I saw secret keys. I saw things that if the bad guys got, they could dig much deeper because, in my case, when I find a non-password protected database, even if I see passwords and everything there, I never use them. That's the whole point of being an ethical researcher is you never bypass credentials. But the real, concern here is companies that provide a service, and this is a very valuable service. It helps companies with their billing, with their inventory, invoicing. So this is a very valuable service that the industrial sector needs. But what happens is when you have an application or you have a dashboard, all of those files have to be stored somewhere. And the problem is where you run into getting from point A to point B. So a lot of times they'll be stored in a cloud storage repository and the whole database will be password protected, but the individual files are open so they can be delivered through the dashboard. And the problem with that is once you see that file path, you can track it back. And then 9 times out of 10, you can see every document that's in the entire database.
Wow. So when you say misconfigured, this was just basically there weren't the layers of security that would be necessary to protect all this individual data.
No, not at all.
Wow.
Yeah, it was completely open. I mean, anyone with an internet connection could have seen it if they knew where to look. I think some FBI statistic last year was like 98% of cyber incidents happen through human interaction, social engineering. I do consulting sometimes, and we've run tests on companies, and we tried to make it fun. We didn't name them and shame them, but we cloaked emails. We sent them with, phishing links, and you would be amazed at the people that fall for that. And these are good, educated people. The thing is, especially with artificial intelligence, a few years ago, when you got the email that your uncle from Nigeria died and left you his lottery winnings, or, some beautiful woman is trapped somewhere and they took her passport and she only needs $500 to come marry you. A very small number of people fell for that. But you could look at the grammatical mistakes. You could look at, whatever email account they had used. It was very, very easy to identify. And I've seen some of the ways that especially some of the scammers are using AI for crypto scams and different things. It's indistinguishable. I mean, especially because it's written near perfectly. People in our industry, we're suspicious of everything. So I'll send you to one of my websites that has a tracking pixel and see where you really are, unless you're using a VPN. So the average person just working their job, doing their day-to-day life, being aware and understanding that threats are out there and they're coming, and you are the weak link. Human error is the weak link. We know for a fact that there is no such thing as perfect every system can be compromised, like almost guaranteed. Like even blockchain, and it may take some time in a supercomputer, but even blockchain can be compromised. So there is no, bulletproof vest for cybersecurity. The human factor really is the most dangerous part. And it reminds most of my stuff is focused primarily on data breaches. That's my specialty. And in that space, even now, there's a lot of activity with ransomware, with, just nation states coming in and harvesting that data, and we don't know how it's going to be used later. And when I say that, so I've found numerous just massive data collections on Russian and Chinese IP addresses. So clearly they've collected quite a bit of data sets and housed them, and then they leak the data that they harvested. And of course, there's nothing you can really do with that except for report it to the authorities, try to figure out, if the company that's hosting it is in a country that's favorable to, a takedown notice or something like that. So that's the real fear, is if you are a company and you do have some intellectual property, and intellectual property is a broad definition. What damage could a nation state do with that? Could they clone the things you, especially in an industrial setting, like let's say you manufacture something, where's your blueprints? Here's the blueprints, here's the customer. Now we just took your business. And we know that our dear friends in the People's Republic would never do anything like that, but it's always a concern.
Well, and those hacks, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, you can always reverse engineer them a little bit too. If you can start with the customer and work backwards with the way everything is connected right now, especially with supply chains, we've seen that as well, where it was the customer that got hacked and they used that to get into the retailer, the distributor, the manufacturer, and going from there. And any one of those links being vulnerable shuts everybody down. It's just a huge ongoing concern, and it really perpetuates that ransomware surge that we continue to see.
Yeah, and it's so easy to distribute malware, especially when you look at these, to take it back to this click balance discovery, 381,000 emails. And these are people who are in an industry that they service.
That's going to wrap things up, but thanks so much for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or MBTmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.